Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Susan Hunter, a farmer who lives in Unity, Maine. Sue and her husband were longtime dairy farmers, and after her husband passed away, Sue turned to hay farming. A few years ago, testing of her soil, which she talks about in our conversation, revealed that her land was heavily contaminated with PFAS, human-made chemical compounds that are known as forever chemicals. Sue decided to partner with researchers from the University of Maine and then other organizations to find out ways that PFAS contamination could be addressed. That research is ongoing today. Sue was part of a session at the 2025 Maine Science Festival, and I was fortunate enough to moderate that session. I'm delighted that Sue is willing to talk about how she has come to be part of Maine's science community, and I think there's a lot to be learned from her for all of us. Our conversation was recorded in June 2025. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Sue, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I am really excited to have you on. You have such a different path to science than many of the people I talk to. And I was fortunate enough to hear you speak at the most recent Science Festival where we did a session on PFAS. So before we get into how you got into the terrible world in many ways of PFAS pollution and trying to find a solution, I was hoping you could give us a little bit of your background, which will help people understand why you're a more unusual guest than most people that we have.
Sure. My background is I was a dairy farmer with my husband for many years on his home farm. And then the farm that I'm on now was a collaboration between the two farms separating and us acquiring this piece of property. So the farm owned it before we did. And then we started a farm in 2009, built a brand new barn, and started with 60 cows and had at one point 120 milk cows. 6 months after we built our barn, my husband actually became sick with cancer and fought cancer for 5.5 years. And after he passed away, I decided about a year after that, I would go ahead and sell my animals. And then in that process, I thought, well, I've got all this beautiful land. I'm going to go ahead and just be a hay farmer, which made it really good. I had partnered up with a local organic dairy farmer. I had put my farm into organics, and we had a great thing going. I would mow, his child would ted, and I would go ahead and bale, and then they would come take the bales away, and we were both happy. And then somewhere down the road, they were testing milk for the state of Maine, and his milk ended up being tested. And through his great record keeping, we were able to determine that some of the hay that was contaminating his animals was coming from my farm. And then at that point, I was contacted by the state, and we did extensive testing on the field and found out it was contaminated, and we had a variety of levels of contamination. So I farm about 100 tillable acres here on the farm, and about a third of the farm was contaminated to the point where I couldn't use the land and sell the feed. So that started a whole ball of fire rolling. I was working with a lawyer who was also my financial advisor to make sure that the farm was going to be profitable and we were going in the right direction when this happened. So we kind of stood in our feet and took a 360 turn and said, what can we do? How can we make the farm still viable? Options came up, do you just want to sell the farm, get rid of the farm? And I did not want to do that. It's a legacy of my husband. I was hoping to be able to pass it down to some of my kids that were here that still wanted to farm. My oldest son was starting to get involved in some of the field work at that time. So we contacted the state of Maine and talked to representatives out there in the Department of Ag. And they gave me the contact of Diane Rowland from the University of Maine. And that's where we started, sitting around my table in my little house with some researchers and Diane and a couple of people from the state of Maine Department of Ag and my lawyer and myself. And they were interested in research. We had such a variety of numbers on our farm, so they didn't have to go here and there to get certain types of research done. And we started that process going. And so that gave me an incentive to learn more about PFAS. It's very interesting to talk to the scientists and work with them on some of the results that they've found on our land. We are now into the third year of research, And we have extended not only research with the University of Maine, but we are working with Andrew Carpenter from Northern Tilt from Belfast, who's a soil scientist. We are now working with American Farmland Trust on doing some biochar research. And then we have Ellen from the Extension Agency from the University of Maine, who's been doing a 3-year crop, perennials, annuals, to see how that works over time, what it's taking up in the plant, and is there any deficit in the accumulation of that plant.
So I'm going to ask a few questions. You said milk was tested. Was that standard testing? And if so, have they always tested for PFAS, or was that a new test?
No, that's a new test. I mean, it has been going for a few years now. They were doing store testing. So they would go to the store and they would test milk and see if there was any levels. They've known that there's been some issues with PFAS a few years. And so they were testing that. And then they started doing individual testing of farms. And so this is where they came up with that.
So when exactly did you find out that you were in such contaminated straits?
In about 2020, 2021, the last part of 20, we came back with the first testing, and that's when they decided it was some feed from my land. So then 2021 is when we really started having the impact, because come that spring, we couldn't farm 2/3 of our property, and we didn't know what we were going to do.
One other question, and then we can dive into some other things. You had said one of the reasons your land was so useful to researchers is because of the different levels. And by that, I'm guessing you mean the different amounts of contamination. It's not consistent through your land. So there's all different kinds of intensity. Is that true?
Yes. So when the state of Maine wanted to come in and test our land, they basically wanted to just do a test of collaboration. They would take certain samples in certain parts of the field, and then they would mix it together, and they would have one sample that would give you a level. We said we don't want them to do that because we farm each piece of land here in certain ways. We have some that are in grass. We have some that we till up and put rye in and new seedings in. And we had just farmed this land differently over the past few years, that we felt that it was important for us to have it tested separately. Also, we had land that was roadside. We had land that was way down next to a wood line and a bog. So we felt with that spreading of contaminated product that maybe it isn't up here in the front part of the field where we're near houses and we're near the road. So that's why we asked them to test it. And then luckily for us, it worked out to our favor because it actually gave us really true results from different parts of the property that caused us to now making different decisions on what we can and can't grow on that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting and thoughtful move to realize that the way you use the land doesn't make sense to just mix it all together and have kind of a sample. So for our listeners who didn't get the opportunity to hear you talk with the researchers like I did, we'll back up a little bit. So PFAS are per and polyfluoroalkyl organofluorine chemical compounds that are human-made. Primarily, if I have my history correct, in the early 70s by 3M. They are in virtually everything that you can think of, slowly making their way out of products. But, everything from rain gear to wax on skis. I mean, you name it, it's in there. So if you don't mind giving a little bit of a background, I'm assuming you have figured out how this all ended up on your land, the huge amount of contamination. And this is a problem I think that certainly many farmers in Maine are facing, but many smaller farms all around the country as well.
Sure. Years back, when my husband's family owned the field, it came to approach many of the farmers that are in this situation now, that they had this waste product from these sewer districts that they needed to get rid of, and they were high in nutrients. And they approached farmers with the idea that this was going to be a very good thing for the farmer to spread on their land. It was free fertilizer. So what farmer isn't going to say, okay? And of course, this was approached from the Department of Environmental Protection. So we went through a regimen of soil samples and different paper applications and things like that and got approved for it. My land sits on a major route, Route 9 and 202. And it's very easy accessible, especially when rural roads are not able to be driven on during the spring when there's weight limits. So I was very accessible for having this dumped on this piece of property. And it came from the Kennebec sewage, which houses most of the waste product from the paper plate plant in Fairfield. And as we all know, the reason that your paper plate does not leak when you put your food on it is PFAS. It's the chemical PFAS that's binding with that paper product to cause it not to leak. So that is where our contamination came from. And because we were in an accessible place, then we were one of those ones that was highly recommended.
Yeah, and this is such a heartbreaking story in so many ways, especially for those of us who went to school and college in the late 80s and 90s, and we were all trying to figure out how you do circular systems so that you find a way to use the waste. The frustrating part is that the end user, you guys with the fertilizer, certainly were never made aware of the existence of these chemicals. And a bunch of really great reporting has been done to show that 3M knew this was a problem and hid it to people who then ended up using it. So it's just a devastating situation in many ways. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you in particular was because, one of the options for you really was to just kind of close up shop and move on. And you chose not to do that. And you talked about that a little bit when you first spoke. And I'm just curious, what was it that made you realize like this is something you have an opportunity to kind of help figure out if there's a solution and really open your entire fields, all of your land up to really intense research projects?
Well, I think one of the things is farmer is a farmer. And most people would say, okay, I'm just going to sell it for what I can get out of it. And I'm just going to move on to a different place. It was such a beautiful piece of property. And I had a feeling down in me that something could happen and it could come back. And not only was it my feeling, but it was also my family's feeling that they had a bond with this place. And it wasn't anything that we just wanted to give up on. We thought of many things. We thought about it's 100 acres of open land, housing development, things like that. But then you're looking at my water was contaminated. So you're going to sell it to a developer, and then they were going to say, well, we're going to have to put in all these filter systems in order to build on it. And building just wasn't it. I have been in Maine all my life. I've lived here in Unity all my life. And I've been farming since I was 17 years old. And the open land, the farmland, and just to drive by a beautiful field and see all the nice things that farmers are doing to it is just always been in my heart. So I wasn't ready to give up. And then my curiosity is probably what got me as far as learning to do the science. I was never a science major, but I'm always intrigued at things. And so this really intrigued me on their ideas of what they had in mind, of what they wanted to do. And then as I got into it, it was definitely more intriguing.
I bet. I love watching people figure out how can they solve problems. So I'm not going to make you explain the research like you're a graduate student, but I just want to talk about it because there's some really great, interesting things going on. You mentioned, I think, the biochar with the American Farmland Trust, and I assume that that's to see if that will soak up the PFAS. I know from the session we did at the Science Festival, there was different explorations of plants. I think it was a tomato plant would possibly take the PFAS in the leaves, but not the fruit. And I think one of the most interesting things for me for that session, and for actually, I imagine quite a bit of the work that's happening, is that you are getting immersed into the fact that one of the things with this research is the answer oftentimes is no, it doesn't work. So then you have to come up with a new one. So I'm curious at how much you've been able to pay attention to the different parts of what's going on your land and have people explain the overlap of the way that they're approaching it.
Sure. Our first experiment was with a grad student at University of Maine, and she did several different things. Her project has actually ended, and her report, I believe, is out somewhere in the university news. She did tomatoes, she did lettuce, which tends to be one of the most accumulators of that, and tall fescue. So she tried to do pairing up two different types of plants to see if the one that's a more of an accumulator would take it away from the other one. She did find out that the tomato fruit does not collect the PFAS in it, but the plant is bringing it up through their plant as it's growing. So that was very interesting. And then we figured that the lettuce is not anything that you can grow in a PFAS contaminated piece of property because the roots are so into the ground and it's so reliable on the water that it takes up that it's just sucking it right up into the plant. And then, of course, Ellen's project, which is she's doing annuals and perennials, she has found out that the grains that she's planted, the rye, the wheat, the oats, the seed itself is not absorbing the PFAS in it, but the stalks, of course, do have it. So you cannot use that for straw because straw is used in animals' pens and animals tend to eat their straw. May not eat a lot of it, but they'll eat enough so that it may affect them, especially dairy cows. And so the transition for our farm and how it's helped us is the fact that we know that there are certain levels on our farm because of the way we tested that we can safely say we can grow grains on it, harvest the grain, and feel safe about that grain not being PFAS contaminated. And then different grasses. So Ellen is working on some different grasses. Her project is not completed. And so I'm not sure about her results, but she is looking at forage that dairy cows would eat or beef cows would eat, or that you would feed to other animals, sheep, goats, horses, to see if those will affect those animals. So this is her third year in this project. She's also done a lot on the depth of how the PFAS is going down in. And as we said, the variety of the field is very unique. And I think this is in some fields anyways, but it's like you might have part of your field be a high absorption and another part be a lower absorption of the PFAS. So it's very interesting to see. And then, of course, one technical thing that I learned was precursors, which I had no idea what precursors were when I started here. And I think Alex explained at our science thing the best explanation, and I think we had a fun with that, is when she said that the long chain PFAS carbon, and then it breaks up into the little chains, which are the precursors, which are like toddlers, and they're running around all over the place. So does that have an effect on how the different parts of the land are coming up with higher levels and lower levels? So that was very interesting to me, and she did a great job explaining that, and that stuck in my head.
Yeah, and it's a total visual with a toddler. You know exactly what you're getting.
Exactly what's happening.
Are you surprised as a farmer that not only different plants have different pull-ups, but different parts of the plant?
Very much, yes. I would assume as that plant is pulling it up, it's coming up and going into all of it. I mean, we understand a little bit as a plant as it grows, you know, how it's taking up stuff, but you just assume that everything it's taking just works its way up to the top of the plant and to the fruit.
The tomato one I find really interesting, right? I mean, you still have an issue with the green part of the plant and PFAS contamination, but it does provide an opportunity to really think about, oh, maybe this is something that we could at least, grow for ourselves. But I'm curious if any of the choices of what is being grown is something that you and your family may at one point be able to get back into being farmers for. Has that been part of the decision-making process?
That has been. And that's one of the things that we said when we spoke with the state of Maine. I mean, they do have their PFAS research and they also have their PFAS fund to help farmers. And the transition for us to go into more grain farming versus hay farming, which is what we totally were, there's a cost there. We don't have the equipment for that. And so that's something that we're working with the state of Maine to try to make that transition over to maybe having more of our farm be grain farming. And then, of course, we'll make sure that that's all PFAS free, the grain itself. So there's different equipment needs that we have, and we're hoping that we can work with them to help us transition over to that.
How does it feel to become essentially a spokesperson for owning land where for a generation or two people thought they were doing the right thing, and then all of a sudden realizing you've got this devastating situation you need to clean up, and then pivoting and saying, let's do research on it? I mean, maybe you wouldn't call yourself a spokesperson for that, but It is hard to do a search for PFAS farmer in Maine and not have you come up.
Well, I think one thing always pops in my mind, and this is probably why I went this way, is my husband had an aunt who had breast cancer many, many years ago before any treatment was available. And she said one day to me, when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. And every time I think about trying something new or getting into a situation where, you're in a hard spot and that comes up to me and I'm thinking, okay, so we need to look outside the box and we need to figure out how to make it work.
That is kind of the perfect approach to science, I think. The people who I have talked to who are most innovative and doing really interesting work, that is their approach to how they look at things. So for me, this looks like it has been a destiny, maybe a lifetime coming, but it feels to me like you have found a really solid place to tap into curiosity and not to be too corny with it, but really trying to make the world a better place.
Absolutely.
Well, I appreciate this. I think it's been really good to hear from someone who, as you said, you haven't taken science classes, but you've always been interested in it. I think what you're doing with your land is truly extraordinary and something that is going to help not just science, but help agriculture all around the country. I'm immensely grateful for your willingness to let me badger you with questions, but more importantly, for your willingness to talk about this impact that it's had on you. Like we said earlier, you could have just kind of hunkered down and not done anything with it, and you have chosen to really dive in. I can't wait to see the different research that comes out of your fields. I'm going to include a bunch of links in the show notes to the different things. I'm actually going to find Rachel's dissertation, if I can, and link to it. But I'm beyond grateful, both for your willingness to talk to me and what you're doing to try to make this a better situation.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by following us on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is executive produced and hosted by me, Kate Dickerson, and edited and produced by Scott Loiselle. And the Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.